You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast, a place for real conversations with people who love someone with the disease of addiction. Now here is your host, Margaret Swift Thompson.
Welcome back to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast. Today, we continue our conversation with Casey Arrillaga, who details his recovery from sex and love addiction. Casey openly shares his story and delves into complexities of addiction, discussing topics ranging from setting boundaries to the effectiveness of recovery programs. Let's get back to Casey.
The Embrace Family Recovery Podcast.
When did you reach the stage of there is going to be enough versus never believing there's going to be enough?
I don't know if I could put a date on that one or a specific moment, but I'll say that has been part of the process of recovery. And I first, depending on how you define recovery, so to kind of pick up a little bit of the story, when I was 20, I don't know if exactly hit bottom. I was, again, not aware of the addiction, but I was aware that, I was having one of those college relationships where it was just all sex. That's all it was. And I recognized, even this is not doing it. This is not cutting it. So I walked away from any kind of romantic or sexual connection for about 6 months. And I just thought, I need to reset my brain. I didn't know anything about the biology to say reset my brain, but I was just kind of I need to figure something out. Because I still had that sense if there's a problem, it's got to be me. What am I not getting right? Anybody I'm attracted to turns out to be bad news. I can easily pick out the sickest person in the room. I would now look back and say what I didn't know then, which is I can pick out the other person who went through the trauma and didn't have it resolved. And I can still now spot that person in the room, but I no longer go running in that direction. It's more like, oh, okay, yep, see that, not where we're going. So I made this decision, okay, I'm working on me.
Yeah.
And I will say, even when I broke up with the young women where it was a purely sexual relationship, and I had a very familiar conversation at that point about it's not you, it's me. And, I just recognized we're not working out very well. And she said something that no one had ever said to me before about a relationship, which is, did it ever occur to you we could work on some of this? And the correct answer was, nope, never crossed my mind. My project to work on me was very much a solo project still. So she drops this bomb. And it isn't like I would look back and go oh, wow, we could have worked on that relationship. We just weren't the right two people. But I did come out of it. And so at the end of that 6 months or so, I said, okay, I have what I would now identify as a standard and a dating plan. And so the standard was I'm not going to date anybody who's not working on themselves. That is the deal breaker. That is if you got this going on, great. If you don't, there's nothing else to talk about. There's no second date. You got to be willing to work on yourself and work on the relationship. I'm willing to work on me. And I'm 20. So I'm we can get through anything. That might be a touch optimistic, but nonetheless, it felt right.
It's a 20.
And my standard was we're not going to sleep together for the first month, which was also, again, kind of a new thing. So it's this idea of okay, if I've got these two things in place, maybe I will not make all the mistakes I've always made. And I dated a few people, but as a musician, I was also, writing songs with people and collaborating and stuff like that. I was writing and recording with one particular person and started to notice after every rehearsal when we were talking that, she was talking about she sees this therapist and talking about her family dynamic. And I'm going oh, you were on the wavelength. This is great. Boy, am I going to screw up this great recording partnership if I tip the hat that I think she's kind of cute. But I did eventually because I knew I needed to say something. And she said, hey, me too. And we were off and running. We got, she would now identify that she also is a recovering sex and love addict. And so good sex and love addicts, we were engaged within 4 months. We were married 5 months later. And we've been married over 34 years. But that's partly because she said, hey, if we're going to get married, we should go see my therapist. And I kind of painted myself in a corner because I talked a good game. It was but I hadn't ever let anyone else in on that level. So it really kind of scared me. But after about 3 to 6 months of therapy, I was really warming up to it and started deciding everyone needed to see a therapist. And we did therapy with that therapist, who was brilliant, Lee Strassman. We saw her for 6 years, and she is still one of my heroes. She was a licensed clinical social worker. I'm now a licensed clinical social worker. I had a phone call with her like 30 years later. And one of the things I said, as we were talking, I said, wow, Lee, I never realized how much I imitate you. Like some of the things you're saying, those are the things that I say to my clients. And I love it. She said, oh, honey, I'm just imitating George, my old therapist. We just pass it along. Like, okay, cool.
How was she your hero? What would you say was what made her your hero?
She was very straightforward about things that I had trouble talking about. She had fantastic insight. And my wife and I like to say, everyone's got kind of a superpower. My wife's superpower is love. And I don't want to say I'm jealous of that, but I'll say I admire it and I aspire towards it. But my superpower is insight. And that has not always been a great thing. It made me a much more effective sex and love addict. But, there's that 10-year-old saying, oh, wait, it's me. And if I change, things will get better. There's that insight. And so that's always been there. And I've used it for good. I've used it for addiction. But she just had it in a beautiful way. And I've seen some therapists where, like, by the end of the session, you figured out what the problem is. And Lee would be on the problem in the first 5 minutes. And then we spent the rest of the hour working on the problem. And I'd never really seen a therapist before. I think my parents trotted me to a couple people, but it was always like one session and like, what's wrong with the kid? And no one can figure it out and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure there were people that tried to help along the way. But Lee was somebody where we just connected. And that therapeutic rapport is so important. But I picked up on her insight. I picked up on her just being straightforward about things. There was never any shame about anything. She was just like, oh, honey, it's whatever. It's what people do. And by the way, I'm doing a terrible imitation of her accent. If she hears this, she'll probably throw something at me. She's from Long Island. I can't do a great Long Island accent. But yeah, she was just somebody where I used to think of her as being enlightened, and she would laugh and say, oh, I'm working towards enlightenment. She goes, no, honey, we're not getting enlightened. We're doing therapy. But it felt like that. It felt like somebody opening up the curtains and saying, here's all this stuff, and let me just name things for what they are. And she was right so much of the time.
There was something in her that allowed you to take the mask off, be vulnerable.
She just saw right through it and would name it, but in a way that was gentle and loving. It wasn't like rip it off in front of your girlfriend, because a lot of this was couples therapy, remember? So I'm sitting next to the young woman that I'm planning on marrying, and this therapist who just like shines a spotlight right through my heart was never like living out my fear of, okay, I'm going to expose all this stuff to your fiance. It was just more like, well, have you noticed this? Or it sounds like that. Or she'd do a lot of guided imagery, which today has morphed into internal family systems therapy, but it was very much that same idea. And she did it wonderfully. So she would draw the answers out of me. She had the right questions. I had all the answers. And she was very clear on that one as well. And that's something that I try and transmit to all my clients as well. Like, you have all the answers. I have the questions. I have context. You have content. I will ask, and it's up to you what you want to answer. But I also had, I've been on this growth path for about 10 years at that point. So I had some sense once I got over the initial distrust and discomfort of like, cool, roll up our sleeves, let's do this. And just jump in and go after it. And so we got along really well.
It's very cool. Don't know where you stand on spirituality, though I recognize one of your titles touches on it. I think that people are put in our path when we don't necessarily expect it, know it's going to be such a pivotal relationship. And I call those God winks, higher power moments, whatever, where you're put in the path of somebody who gives you such gifts to help you understand yourself. And it sounds like Lee was that for you.
She was one of two people. The second one was, in terms of that kind of relationship, was a second therapist that I saw some years later, Maggie Bryant. And then she was the one who in the first 5 to 10 minutes of the session said, have you ever heard of sex addiction? And my answer was like, no. But now that you've said that out loud, like, okay, I'm going to hang out with people who go to 12-step meetings, or I hung out with a lot of people that had gone to 12-step meetings for a while and dropped out and relapsed, because if I'm in active addiction, I'm going to hang out more with people who are in active addiction than not. But I saw Maggie for 3 years, and she was, again, just amazing. And same sort of thing, a little bit of a different energy, but the same basic idea of just being able to see right through things and name something and knew what to do with it. Like if I was like, okay, you're right. Wow, I didn't see that. What do we do about that? She'd say like, okay, here's what we do about it, and had great tools.
So let's talk about sex and love addiction for the population that may not know it, identify it, believe it. Like, let's cover it a little bit, if you don't mind. Yeah. Like, what is a definition that you would share for people out there who this may be their first exposure to that being a possible addiction?
I would say that the best framing that I've heard, and I've heard this at a recovery meeting, somebody said, really, it's an affirmation addiction. I'm addicted to affirmation. And for me, I would say for me personally, sex and love were two ways to mainline that affirmation. That was just, here's the purest form, because that was my earliest exposure. But I'd also point out that, and this is why I think there's debate in the field and researchers saying, well, we looked at the brain, we're not really seeing it. Because people, for instance, I just speaking frankly about all this stuff, they'll focus on the orgasm, say, well, you can't develop a tolerance and there's not really withdrawal and stuff like that. But if that's not really what it's about, if it's really about, I need somebody to tell me I'm okay, and that's either going to come through sexual conquest, whether I am conquering or being conquered, it's going to come through that idea of I am wanted. I mean, my drug of choice would really be that look that somebody got in their eyes, that like, I'm not sure I can be okay without you, Casey. I would eat that up.
Right.
And if I saw that in somebody who I was not even otherwise attracted to, I would go out of my way to gravitate towards that person. I didn't even want anything to do with them, except they had that look in their eye where they wanted me. And so, okay, I'm just going to try and reel that in. And it went right back to, you need to get their attention, hold it as long as I can, get as much as I can, as fast as I can. And you better bet there are withdrawals.
Yeah.
Sex and love addicts can tell you there are heavy withdrawals when the object of your affirmation goes away for whatever reason. And even people who are, cranking through people and all that kind of stuff and just thinking, okay, so it's not any one individual person. It may be the constant novelty of new people, but take that supply away and you're going to find somebody curled up sweating in a ball in the corner in the fetal position because you've taken away what they think is keeping them alive. And yet, going back to Judy Grisel, there's never enough. There's no amount of that you feel like, oh, okay, now I'm satisfied for more than a couple minutes. And then it's back into withdrawal. And people will tell you about, being with a romantic partner and they're still thinking about the next person, having sex with someone and in the middle of sex, thinking about the next person or the next time. It's got all the hallmarks as far as I can tell. There is withdrawal. There is definitely tolerance. People talk about, well, you can't really die from an overdose. It's like, no, but there's a lot of suicide.
Yeah.
It's kind of like gambling addiction or compulsive debting, spending, stuff like that. There's a lot of suicide.
And there's a different level of shame around sex addiction and love addiction because we live in a society where we can't talk openly about this on a good day, right? So there's a lot of judgment and stigma about it. I want to ask, it's amazing when you're telling me your definition and you're describing it, I'm hearing, for me, I'm a food addict. I'm hearing the same stuff around food, and then parallel it over to substances, using and thinking of the next use, never having enough, preoccupation, withdrawal, tolerance. I mean, it is all universal.
Yeah. And doing the work that I do now, I work with people who are coming off of heroin, who are coming off methamphetamine, of course, tons that are coming off alcohol. And I'm very lucky at the treatment center where I am at Windmill Wellness Ranch. We get to have a focus group that's about sex and love addiction. So I get to run that once a week. When I was first approached about this, like years ago, actually at a different treatment center, I was really nervous about like, oh man, what's it going to mean professionally? Like, what's it going to look like if I run this group? And I was like, yeah, but it feels like it needs to be done because there's so many people who are chemically addicted to other things that don't recognize that this one has been going along for pretty much their entire lives, way before they got their hands on a drink or a different drug, because alcohol is just a drug. So alcohol or any other drug, long before that, they were into food, they were into sex, they were into love. And again, love in this case is not like beautiful romantic. It's usually more like romantic obsession. And the sex usually has more to do with power than anything else. it's not maybe what people are thinking of it, but also another aspect to it. You mentioned food addiction. I think food addiction and sex and love addiction, which I just kind of glump into one thing, those two addictions I think are the toughest because they're the only two things we can get addicted to that are a natural, normal part of the life process that we need to survive, that we are genetically programmed. Every single human being has a certain amount of genetic programming to say, you need this. And you can now say there are people who identify as asexual or aromantic who are just like, I don't get it at all. So I'll just say, yes, there are some outlying people where like maybe none of this applies.
Right.
But even then, they need food to survive, right? There's something there. There's something where your body and your brain say you can't be okay without this.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out you can get addicted. That's a horrible combination. It really is. In all of those cases, there are a lot of people, you're right, who look from the outside and say, it's an excuse, and especially sex addiction. It's an excuse for bad behavior. You're just coming up with some reason to eat all you want, or you're coming up with some reason to sleep with whoever you want, or to date a whole bunch of people at the same time, or to spend hours in romantic fantasy. It's just an excuse. But all I can tell you is I've been sitting in the rooms of recovery with people around this stuff for 24 years now. Nobody in there is looking for an excuse. They're desperate to get out of it. And that is one of those basic things around addiction. Does it make your life worse?
Yep.
Are you desperate to get out of it? And do you find that when you decide to, not as easy as you thought?
Right. Those three should be highlighted.
This podcast is made possible by listeners like you.
I have exciting news. My former guest of the Embrace Family Recovery podcast, William Cope Moyer, the author of Broken, from episodes number 43 through 45, in case you want to go and revisit his powerful episodes, has another book available to be pre-ordered with the release date of September. William's new book is entitled Broken Open, and the description includes the following. William didn't know something was missing until it happened. He'd been in recovery for alcohol and drugs for years. He was a recovery activist and a spokesperson for the gold standard of treatment and recovery organizations. He was a model leader and follower of 12-step programs, but still, he slipped. And his slip lasted a few years. Privately, he was addicted to painkillers while publicly saying he was in recovery from alcohol and drug use. So was he still in recovery? How could this happen to someone who did everything, quote, right, unquote? How did it go so wrong? I don't know about you, but I am really eager to read more about William's journey. Pre-order Broken Open on Amazon or through Hazel and Betty Ford's publishing department. Find the links in my show notes below. And let's support William Cope Moyers and his newest written work, Broken Open.
You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery podcast. Can you relate to what you're hearing? Never miss a show by hitting the subscribe button. Now back to the show.
So again, another person sitting out there listening going, okay, I can jive with this as an addiction. Where do you get help? Like you just said, you put the food, love, and sex together because those are, quote, things everybody has a need for, have to eat to survive. What does recovery look like? Where do you find help? What is abstinence if you use that model from a recovery standpoint?
Right. So this is a thing that I talk with my clients a lot when we do this group, is this is not an abstinent-based recovery, which in some ways is tougher. Mm-hmm. Because with alcohol or cocaine or whatever, you're like, or gambling, which is acknowledged as an addiction.
It is.
Within the psychiatric community anyway. The secret is stop doing that. And that's a tough call. It's not easy to just stop. But if I go to someone who's like a meth addict and I say, what you need to do is do 3 bumps of meth a day, but don't do more than that. That's really, really hard.
Correct.
So, I've heard people in Overeaters Anonymous. That's one place that people can go around food. There are other food recovery programs. There's 12-step programs for practically everything out there. So off the top of my head, Sexaholics Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, Love Addicts Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sexual Recovery Anonymous. Those are 5 12-step programs I know off the top of my head that would deal with those things. Love Addicts Anonymous is the one where it's kind of all under one tent.
Mhm.
And by the way, with those, some of the differentiators between them are the sobriety definition, because Sex Addicts Anonymous and Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous both say, sort of define what your own abstinence looks like, but there's a big asterisk next to that saying, consult with experienced members of the program so you don't just talk yourself into something that sounds kind of okay, but still allows for a lot of destruction of self and others. So in SLAA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, they would talk about setting bottom lines. These are the things that would be the equivalent of an alcoholic drinking alcohol. This is the thing where, like, if you do this, you have definitely crossed the line.
Mm-hmm.
And step one of every 12-step program says, we admitted we were powerless over fill in the blank, and it made our lives unmanageable.
Mm-hmm.
So you could look and say, what am I powerless over? In other words, I tell myself I'm going to stop, but I don't. I tell myself I'm going to do a little, but I do a bunch. If I start, I don't know where it's going to end. And also that make my life unmanageable. So these things are also going to lead to destruction of self, others, property, lifestyle, legal status, self-esteem, all that kind of stuff. If it's got both of those going on, I would tell somebody that's probably a bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
SLAA will also often talk about like middle lines, these things that lead to bottom line behavior, and they'll talk about top lines. What are your healthy behaviors? So we're not just focusing on what's negative, but sort of what do you need to not be doing? What leads you to doing the things you shouldn't be doing? And what are some things that are really healthy in your life that you can be focusing on instead? Because recovery is pretty hard if all you're thinking about is don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. You have to think about what just am I running away from? What am I running towards? Now, I'll point out 12-step recovery is not the only game in town.
Right.
Probably one of the best known sort of alternatives would be a SMART recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And although there are others out there, SMART's the largest and best established of these sort of we are not a 12-step programs, but they run on the same basic principles. And the cool thing is the research shows they're just as effective. So there was a year-long study that is, I'm going to say within the last 4 or 5 years, where they showed that SMART Recovery, Alcoholics Anonymous, Life Running Secular Sobriety, and a group called Women for Sobriety, which I had never heard of before the study, all 4 of those tracked people for a year. They're all equally effective. But there were some big factors that they noticed in common. One, they all say, let's get together with other people who are struggling with this thing and support each other.
Right.
So they identified 4 major factors. One is, have you been to a meeting in the last month? Mm-hmm. Second was, have you gotten phone numbers of people so you can talk to them in between meetings? So it's not the meeting is the only place I see someone, but actually I have other opportunities to reach out. Third one was, have you volunteered to help at the meeting in any way? Mm-hmm. And the fourth one was, have you volunteered to lead the meeting? Which SMART recovery, you have to become a SMART facilitator, has to be running the thing. But then if a SMART facilitator is running it, they can say, hey, John, do you want to come up? You want to come up to the board and show an exercise and stuff like that. And SMART recovery does have at least one meeting that I'm aware of, or a classification meeting. What do they say? A SMART recovery for maladaptive sexual behavior is like some certain way they phrase it, but it basically comes down to, okay, so that's a sex and or love addiction meeting using SMART recovery tools. And one cool side note, if people are saying, hey, where do I start? What do I check out? They've actually found if you're doing 12-step and SMART together, your odds go up. Where you run into trouble is if you're bouncing between them, like, well, I don't like this one because it got hard, so I'm going to try that one. Oh, that one got hard, let me bounce back. Those people statistically don't do as well. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to, try a few different meetings, try a few different programs. Now, keeping in mind, again, Sexaholics Anonymous, they hand you your sobriety definition, which is, first of all, they only focus on sex. So they're not talking about love, romantic obsession, any of those things, strictly sexual things. They're going to say no pornography, no masturbation, no sexual activity at all, except for your heterosexual married spouse.
Kind of missing a big population there, don't you think?
It's kind of specific, which led to a big fight between their World Service office and the guy who started the program and wrote the book, because he still owned the copyright on the book. And the last I had seen, which is, some 20 years ago, they were in a bit of a knife fight because the World Service Office said, we're not going to publish the book if it says it can only be a heterosexual marriage. And he's saying, well, then you can't publish the book. And so there went the basic text. So I think that actually is what started Sexual Recovery Anonymous. They said, we're going to give you basically the same basic definition, but just a loving, mutually committed relationship. So that widened the tent. Sex Addicts Anonymous will give the same basic model I said for Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, except they say your inner circle, your middle circle, your outer circle. Inner circle would be the same as the bottom lines, the things you're yeah, that's my addictive behavior that I'm trying not to do, etc.
Yeah. Is it normal when people hear this, they think, wow, that sounds like a PhD study in trying to figure out what I am, who I am, what I do, what's healthy, what's not healthy? I mean, it sounds like a lot of having to really get honest with self, which is true in every 12-step program, but like it feels more complex. Is that fair?
Well, I'd say the only really complex thing about it is that you're not actually abstaining. The complex thing is you have to figure out how to live in balance with something where you've probably never had balance that you can ever recall in your life, or your balance went completely off the rails and off a cliff. So it may sound more difficult than it is. You're right. The most difficult, but I say complex thing is being as honest as you can with yourself and recognize that it's not like you're going to define these things and there they go, they're carved in stone, you can never change them, but saying, let's find a starting point.
Right.
After all, if you show up in the rooms of one of these programs, you're there for a reason. You know there is something you do that is not working for you. Whether it is looking at pornography, and again, tolerance is built. You're looking at pornography, and maybe you're looking at more and more, pushing boundary stuff. Maybe you're starting to look at stuff that's illegal. Maybe you're looking at stuff where you think like, wow, I'm going to go to prison. They're there for some reason. Or somebody else might spend, again, hours in romantic obsession. They've almost killed themselves twice over a lover leaving them. Whatever it is that it looks like, whatever it is that's happening, there's some reason you're there. Whatever that reason is a fine place to start for your bottom lines. What's the thing or things that you absolutely know you need to stop doing? Or you are going to die literally or spiritually or psychologically. What's got you here?
And is it true when you look at something that is not abstinent based around sex and love addiction? One of the things that I remember hearing along the lines of the trainings and such I've done was, when is it getting in the way of functioning in your normal life? Like when it is so out of balance that you're physically hurting yourself, that you're maybe not getting to work, that you're not showing up in relationships. Is that a big factor in, again, figuring out what is okay and what is not okay, what is healthy for you when you're trying to establish that boundary or that inner circle for your recovery?
I'd say that's probably the starting point for people, is to look and say, what is wildly out of balance. But this is, again, one of the reasons why I would tell anybody starting off, like, again, I'll just go to the one that's sort of the big umbrella program, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. They have a pamphlet called Setting Bottom Lines that will just walk you through it and have lists of things that people have noticed before and made bottom lines that you could look at and go like, oh, a few of those do apply for me. Like, I hadn't even thought about how much I've been impacted by this behavior, which I'd say right now, one of the biggest things that I see is dating and hookup apps.
Yeah.
Or just like crack cocaine on your phone.
Similar to gambling, right? Everything going online, everything's accessible in your hand. Same with pornography. There's no way to avoid it, in that when I came through, and I don't know if we're about the same age, when I came up, it was like an odd magazine and maybe a VHS tape if one of your friends had one. Now it's like you look online and that fast. It's changing, I'm sure, the journey around pornography, gambling in a drastic way. You must have seen a huge change in your time of being in recovery.
It has been huge. And for the record, I'm 55. So, yes, when I got into recovery, I would say that for the most part, if people wanted pornography, either your friend had something or you had to go to an adult bookstore downtown, which was usually pretty sketch, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I would say right around the time I got into recovery, internet pornography was just sort of becoming a thing. Like, there were no online videos. That didn't exist. But, you could download a photograph if you had enough time and, went and got a cup of coffee while a photograph downloaded. And you were probably going to be somewhere where you had to pay for it. But now, yeah, there's like an unlimited stream of free pornography online, and people who are willing to do whatever online to get attention or monetize it in some way. So yes, it's one of the blessings and curses of the internet, is it connects everybody who's looking to connect with each other. And so where there is a customer, there is a supplier. And if I'm going to say, there's probably a lot of people in sex and love addiction who are working in the sex trade, and I don't have any like moralizing stance around sex work, but just the idea that like the vast majority of people who are involved in that kind of work are people who who need recovery, not necessarily around sex and love addiction. I'll say there's probably plenty of that, but also people that are not recovered from sexual trauma and abuse that are replaying the trauma and abuse. And that will be motivation enough. So yeah, they'll post a whole bunch of free pictures. And of course, once anything's posted online, it's there forever and will get circulated wherever it happens to go. So yeah, there's this unlimited stream, but then with dating/hookup apps, there's a very large supply of people who are looking to have anonymous sex or to get deeply romantically entangled. And people can get into outrageous emotional affairs. And I have friends in the program who have said, like, yeah, I was sleeping with prostitutes. I was dating multiple people. I was in multiple online relationships, just chat relationships with people all over the world that were all about romantic obsession. Some of them, we didn't even know each other's true location. It wasn't about like, let's go hook up. It was just about getting that constant stream of affirmation. And all of this, while the person in question is married.
Right.
And, I was in greater and greater accelerating addiction for the first 10 years of my marriage. And in there, I did start drinking alcohol. So much for my promise to myself.
Yeah. Well, that's just evidences the disease, in my humble opinion, because you were adamant you wouldn't. You never would want to hurt yourself or people you love. You had a disdain for it. And that wasn't enough to stop you when you found it and it was giving you whatever you needed at the time, and then takes over and takes you down a path that's out of your control. Because if you could have stopped it, you would have, just like the sex addiction when you were in the relationship with your wife for 10 years or the sex love addiction.
Yeah. So yeah, alcohol was, people know alcohol burns. It was very, very much gasoline on the fire of my sex and love addiction. From the first sip of alcohol, my brain would just start to accelerate in that direction. And I would give myself permission. I saw a guy walk out of a treatment center one time during the intake screening because he suddenly realized that if he was there to detox and get sober from alcohol, which was his intention, that he wasn't going to be able to pick people up as easily. Right. And on that basis, he packed his stuff up and he packed back in his suitcase and he got in his car and he drove away from his recovery because he realized if he got sober in this one area, he wouldn't be able to act out in this other area. And that was too scary. So that was watching sex and love addiction take somebody out.
No doubt co-occurring addictions are true.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think it's all one big thing called addiction. And these are just the particular way it manifests, which is probably partly genetic, partly, environment and how those things interact and all that kind of thing. Why does one drug or behavior hit a certain person, whereas another one does another one? My wife, who is in recovery around food also, was just at a big convention for Overeaters Anonymous. And she said, yeah, it was like, 50 women and 3 men. And I think like, okay, so, more socially sanctioned, more admitted. I know plenty of women in sex and love recovery for sure. But something else to think about, you talk about genetics. Everybody doesn't have the same number or ratio of taste buds on their tongue. Mm. And there are some people where the average person might have like 1,000 taste buds in a given area. Some people have 10,000. Some people have 100,000. They call them super tasters. And most of them are women.
Interesting.
So would I say that like some people have a genetic push where they're more responsive? I mean, men are famously more responsive sexually, where it's like, oh, okay. So are there more male sex addicts? Probably. Or are there just more men that will admit it? Mm-hmm. Hard to say. Yeah. Are there more women who will say, yeah, I have a problem with food and, never going to talk about all the other stuff? And more men will say, yeah, I have a problem with sex, but I'm not going to talk about other stuff. We don't know. Just like all the stats on women are more prone to depression, or like almost all psychology is based on self-report. Do we know that more women are depressed? Do we know that more women are willing to admit that they're depressed? Right. And there's really currently almost no way to tell the difference.
Join me again next week for my final conversation with Casey as he openly discusses recovery within his relationships, family, and career. We also discuss the books he's written and the inspiration he had to become an author.
I want to thank my guest for their courage and vulnerability in sharing parts of their story. Please find resources on my website, embracefamilyrecovery.com. This is Margaret Swift Thompson. Until next time, please take care of you